All right, I'd like to call this meeting of the West Southwest Milwaukee School Board to order. Sarah, would you please call the roll?
Ms. Kaiser. Here. Mr. Burns.
Here.
Ms. Lee. Here. Ms. Carr. Here. Mr. Sikich.
Present.
Mr. Becker. Excused. Mr. Keller.
Here.
Ms. Deal.
Here.
President Lee.
Here. All right, today we have our workshop on the 23-24 audit review. Did you have any preamble? And over to Mr. Norris and our special guest this evening for Baker Tilly.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's always a thrilling discussion on the audit. So I was joking with Ms. Kaiser that I did not prepare the presentation tonight. You will know that because it's only 8 slides. That's right. That's right. So I'll hand it over to Michelle in a second, but to formally introduce Michelle Walter, she's one of the partners, I believe, right?
Senior manager.
Senior manager at Baker Tilly, and we've had the pleasure of working with her and her team at Baker Tilly since 2018-19, I believe. And so through that, I think what you'll hear tonight is not any secret to you and the board, given our relationship with the finances in the school district. But it's really a collaborative partnership that we have with our auditor. And so what I mean by that is we don't just call them at the end of the year and go, hey, time for the audit. I mean, we are engaging with them, I don't know, weekly, bi-weekly for different questions that come up. Hey, how should this get recorded? What could a journal entry look like? So I think that's the point of a good relationship with the auditors, is to not get caught. It's more to like work through like, hey, we're trying to do this the right way. And how do our systems look and things like that. So with that, I'll turn over to Michelle to kind of dive into all the nuances of what this audit looks like this year. And I have a couple things I'll bring up with your booklets. And if you have questions, feel free.
And as Aaron mentioned, I'm Michelle Walter, senior manager with Baker Tilly. And similar thoughts that Aaron had. You know, if you looked at this report, this presentation to where we were 5 years ago to when we started, it's night and day different. So what I have kind of in these couple slides is very high level, because you know what, things are going well. So we're going to touch on the results of the audit, very, very high level financial information, and some additional information that's included in your financial statements. So overall, the objective of an audit is for us, your auditors, to be able to issue an opinion on that financial statements. And I believe you have a handout of the financial statements themselves, but this is on pages 1 through 3 of the financial statements. So we issued what is called an unmodified opinion. And this is the same for the West Southwest Milwaukee as well as the Deeper Learning. So there are 2 financial statements, and this unmodified opinion basically means that your financial statements are free of any material misstatement, that they include all the required disclosures, and that they're consistent year to year with accounting principles and policies. If you're one that likes to look comparative this year's to last year's, there is what's called an emphasis of matter paragraph in this year's financial statements, and that's because a new accounting standard was implemented. And really, this makes the financial statements look terrible, because you have your food service fund, which it used to be called a non-maintenance. So based on the dollar levels of things, it was reported in the back of the financial statements. Now, because there was more activity, it had to be moved to the front as a major fund. And so because of that, there's columns in both places and it looks kind of funny, but that's no change in how things operate with that fund. It's just a presentation aspect, but we have to call that out.
And just for note, I handed out the district's financial statements and reporting and insights. I have the booklets on DLV if you want them. I just thought for the purpose of this conversation, that would be where most of your questions would come, but I do have them if you want a copy.
There's a couple other reports that we issue besides the financial statements themselves. One of them is the other information that Aaron provided, which is the reporting and insights document. This is an overall summary of the audit itself. We outline our approach for the audit, you know, what are the risk areas or the areas to focus on. We outline how we go about that, what management's responsibility versus our responsibility is. We are required to disclose any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses that we encounter as part of our review of the internal controls or doing the audit. And I'm happy to report there's only one material weakness, and that is because we, your auditors, prepare the financial statements. And I mean, like I said, this has come a long way. And we help prepare the financial statements, the footnotes, and then the schedule of awards for the grants. But that's required if your auditor does that. And I would say most of the school districts we work on, we have that item, but it's really a cost versus benefit situation. Do I think your staff probably could prepare them if they were given the right amount of time? Potentially, but is it worth it in the long run? That's a choice that the district makes, and there's no negative impact of it. Other items that are included in this reporting and insights document are just some required communications we have to have as your auditors. You know, were there any new accounting policies, which I touched on what's included in there with that new accounting standard. It includes any estimates that are included in the financial statements like depreciation or some pension and OPEB amounts. If there were any disagreements with management, we would disclose that, which happy to report. We worked well with the district and the staff, and there were no such disagreements. Other items we might have to, or we put in this letter are independence. We are independent of the school district and vice versa. Next section of this report is the management representation letter. So as part of the audit, we get certain representations from the district that the information they give us is accurate to the best of their knowledge. And the last section on this is called two-way communication. And this is there in reference collaborative effort. You know what, audit is not just once a year. You know, we like to be on top of things. And if something were to come up during the year, not only from Aaron and his team, but if the board has questions or if something comes up, I mean, please feel free to reach out, and our contact information is in the PowerPoint, but you know, it's like I said, not just audit time, but throughout the year and as things come up, and even if it's issues or things hit, how can we make this better?
And just to speak to like the timeline, so we start working with Michelle and her team about end of May, early June, what's called a prelim audit. And that's kind of like trying to get the state of the books in order of like, here's all the things we're gonna need. Let's start like putting into one place for the end of the year, right? And then really, once everything's audited and completed end of July, by about end of August, after journal entries are booked back to the fiscal year, that's appropriate, we start the full audit. And that process this year, I think, took almost 2.5 months, 2-ish months. And that's not every day with her team on site, but you know, what's this report look like? Send us random statements from P-card statements. How about the grants? I mean, it's a process. And so, you know, at the end, I feel like, you know, we're tired, but it's like, it's good. It ensures the systems are working. So I just want to echo your team's efforts on that. So.
Yeah, and as Aaron mentioned, there is another component of the financial statements, and this is called the single audit. And so this is included in the financial statement document starting on page 65. So this is a compliance audit of the federal and state grants that were expended during the year. And so these are because the district spent over $750,000 in federal money, you're required to have this. And so we tested Medicaid, Title I, and child nutrition this year as federal programs. Happy to report there were no compliance findings as well there. So the only finding within that single audit report is because you have that material weakness for the financial statement prep. Once again, completely normal and not tied to a specific program. The last report that we've already referenced is the deeper learning report. So same thing, there's a financial statement packet, much smaller, as well as a reporting and insights document that somewhat mirrors the districts because it's the same structure, the same management, or the same people doing all of the work on that front. Shifting gears a little into the financial information. So the general fund is the district's main operating fund. And a good comparison that we like to look at is the budget versus the action. So when we look overall at the general fund, the district budgeted to add about $2.3 million to fund balance. In actuality, added 4.7 million. So positive swing on that front. And a lot of the difference you could see is made up in that revenue category. So budgeted at about 119 million, or sorry, 118 million came in at about 120 million. mean, a lot of that is additional state awards that were given in the current year. You know, some library aid, mental health grants, as well as some other interest increases, as well as medical reimbursements that kind of drove that being over budget.
Yeah, I pulled that. So if you go to page, 1 second, I have it, 15. There's an item for 994,000 in additional revenue received from the state. And so sometimes it's like, if you look at this in a glance, you go, well, that's $1 million. How the heck is he under budget that? It's because it's not just from one source. It's coded state, but here's some examples. We received about $300,000 in additional common school funds. That's state funds. We received an additional 50,000 AGR funds last year. An additional 360,000 mental health grant supports. That's because less people apply for them. 10,000 in assessed reading grants. 30,000 in the CTE and 30,000 in educator effectiveness. So like it's when you go, hey, there's 7 buckets there. How do we off? Well, there's really like 150 buckets. And
that's
some of them
page
are-
53.
You know what I
You
mean?
can see
So
the details.
it's just, it's a little more difficult to project, so. And that 2.4 that Michelle alluded to, that was the budget amendment process that we did in May. And then again, yeah, that revenue came in a little higher. The 573,000, which is on that list too, a big chunk of that is interest earnings that we earned beyond what we thought. So I think we were at about 1.2 million, and we came in at almost 1.6 million. So that's because CDs and interest rate environments, like, hard to say what's gonna happen with that, but it's good to have more money than expected. The interdistrict increase, there's 400,000 in that rounds up to 1.8 million. That was an increase, nearly all of that is open enrollment dollars in. So we had more kids on waivers, additional year waivers than we thought. Each kid's 8 to 13,000 depending on their status, so you can see how that can happen, so. Just interesting how it pans out at the end of the year.
And there's a lot of ebbs and flows. So some things are over, some things are under. So on page 53, if you were to look at the expenditure grouping, budgeted at about 115 million compared to actual of 114.9. I mean, that's pretty darn close to budget. Once again, a favorable position, but you have some categories that are over, some that are under. So it kind of all washed out at the end. So at the end of the year, once you consider the addition of the $4.7 million fund balance, the general fund has about $40.1 million. Now, this isn't all available to spend. There's about 1.5 million that is categorized as non-spendable. So this is prepaid items. Cash has already gone out the door, but the expense has not hit that fund balance yet. There's also about 709,000 that's restricted for certain grants. That committed bucket is about $6.4 million. And this is made up of 3 items that the board has chosen to kind of earmark. And so committed fund balances, it takes formal action to commit as well as to uncommit. So that's for the computer refresh is about 700,000. Retiree benefits is 3 million. And then the compensation model is about 2.7 million. So that's that bucket.
And I think it's important to note the 40 million is just essentially unrestricted money to the degree that Michelle just explained, but there's also other funds. So our total fund balance is closer to 70 million, right? That includes Fund 80. That includes our capital funds, 46, 49. That includes food service. That includes non-major governmental funds, Fund 21 or OPEB funds, Fund 73. So really, it's like trying to bucket these out to discuss them individually. It makes it a little easier to explain, but it's good that we have a really healthy fund balance of spendable funds.
Yeah.
To be able to use we need, so.
Well, and the district has a policy to have at least 20% of the current year's expenditures be in general fund balance. Actual was at about 35%. And so that's a strong position, and a lot of times we like to look forward as well. So that unassigned and assigned fund balance is a percentage of next year's budget. And that's at about 27% of next year's budget. So that's a very strong general fund balance.
And one thing that I like about currently what we haven't committed is, about half that is for retiree benefits. That's essentially like in our own insurance policy over the new plan. That's to help fund that plan that's working, right? And we'll get into that a little bit later with OPEB. But that's a good thing. Same thing with the compensation piece. We've been talking about that in our committee, Financial Stability and Efficiency Committee, about potentially having some unassigned dollars shifted to that to do the same thing, like fund that appropriately as to make it get off the ground and make it work, right? So to me, it's not like the money is spent and gone, and it's funding a program that's gonna save the district, a dollar for every $3 spent one, right? So it'll work, so.
And so that was the general fund in a nutshell. There's several other funds that we'll touch on very high level, but all of this information is included on page 15 of your financial statements as well. So the next fund is the special education fund. Both revenues and expenditures in this fund for 2024 were about 18.3 million. This special ed fund always zeroes out. For any deficit you have to transfer the money in. So that's why fund balance is at 0. The next column is actually food service fund. And this is that fund that last year it was in the back, now it's in the front.
And it says capital. if you're
And it says
wondering.
capital on the
It should-
slides.
It should say food service. It's just an error.
I'm just
so.
keeping you guys on your toes. But $4.3 million of revenue compared to $5 million of expenditures. So with that decrease in fund balance, the food service was at about $2.2 million. And all of this is restricted for food service purposes. You can't use it for general operations. The community service fund is the next fund. Revenues of about 8.9 million compared to expenditures of about 7.5. So this fund increased fund balance by about $1.3 million up to 7.1. This one has 2 buckets of that fund balance again. A small portion is non-spendable for prepaids, and then the rest is restricted for those community service operations. The capital projects fund had revenues coming in 1.4 million versus expenditures of 7.4 million. So you decrease fund balance there as expected, I would say, based on the projects that were going on. By about 6 million.
And the big one there was the district office on 93rd Street. So that $6 million difference between revenues and expenses is about what it costs to do the project. So the 1.4 difference is essentially what Steve and I and Jeff worked through for capital projects in the school year last year. So that's the reason for the decline.
Yep.
So.
And so capital projects has $13.8 million of fund balance, some being restricted, some being committed, all based on how it was funded. If it was debt funded and you have those unspent proceeds, it's restricted in that manner. The debt service fund, 1.9 million of revenues and fairly comparable with expenditures. So increased fund balance by about $82,000. And this is all restricted to pay future debt service.
That's our energy efficiency debt.
That last column is labeled the non-major funds, and this is a culmination of 2 funds.
It's 2173.
Yeah, it's DLVA and then the gift fund. So the details of this are on pages 62 and 63. And this is where you'll see the funny looking column that is basically blank for the food service. But DLVA ended with fund balance of about $1 million and the gift fund of about $1.8 million. Once again, DLVA has a very small 47,000 of inventory that will be expensed in fiscal year 25. But then the gift fund is restricted. So that fund 21 is restricted for those purposes that the money was given. And then the remaining 969,000 is committed for DLVA. So overall, very high level on the financial numbers, very sound position there. The last slide that I have just kind of outlines some of the other items included in the footnotes in the financial statements. And I would say this data takes up pretty much the bulk of the footnotes.
Yeah.
But you have the ability for your debt limit to borrow a huge number. And so that's on page 34. But you have a lot of capacity if you were needing to borrow. So you aren't close to the verge of, limiting yourself in that respect. The $4 million that's outstanding. The other 3 items on this list are liabilities that have to be recorded based on recent accounting standards. And these aren't current obligations for pension and OPEB, but they're, what could happen entirely in the future. Now, the net pension liability, that's your WRS liability. So that liability as well as the OPEB life are all with the state based on what's getting paid in. WRS liability, sometimes they have good investment years and it flip flops between an asset and a liability, and this data is not recorded in your funds. So your general fund does not absorb the liability that goes here. Same with the OPEB health. And so I have the page numbers that there's probably about 5 pages for each of these describing, you know, how it's calculated and the liabilities and what goes along with it. But
It is interesting though, if you do go to page 39 in this booklet. I find it interesting because
You can see
I don't know.
X-Men.
I do, I shouldn't, but I do. So when you see the page, it says year core fund variable fund. So what's interesting is, and I've spent some time trying to work with staff and teachers explain this. I'm sure some of you who are in this know this, but each staff can change their election at the state from a core to a variable fund. And what that looks like is when you enroll as an educator, anyone in WRS, you're defaulted into core. And that core fund has an average return, I mean, I don't know, 6, 7, probably close to the stock market return on average, like the S&P. But you can change your election to be in the variable fund. And when you do that, 50% of future obligations, whenever you pay your pension every 2 weeks, goes into the variable fund. But the problem is, you can see if you look at this, if you don't change your election back prior to retirement, look at these swings in the variable fund. So essentially your pension at retirement, if you're variable, can go up 25%, up 2, then down 5, well, then down 10 at some point and down 21. And what they do, from an accounting perspective, my understanding, is they essentially record whatever you paid as an obligation to the district at some point, because it is a future liability, even though we haven't paid it yet. So it's interesting, I think, at least. So, yeah.
yeah, anything else with pension or OPEB that you want to go into?
Yeah, just really quick on the OPEB on page 44, bottom of 44, always an interesting fact. We have 946 people that are inactive that are on our OPEB liability, and we only have 856 employees. So we have more people retired drawing from an OPEB liability than we do active. So I did do a quick little analysis here. Of the 979, 894 of them are post 65. And that post 65, 894 comes out to about $1 million of our $3 million liability. That's kind of what we have in terms of an annual budget. The 85 people that are pre 65 come out to about 1.6 million. So more, the 85 people cost more than the 894 people, right?
Mhm.
And so you can kind of see when that 85 number goes to 0, and they'll become in the greater number, but that number costs far less. That's where our OPEB liability at some point will go from 3.3 or 3.4 million a year down to almost 1.2, 1.3. So that's the HRA model kind of at work. And it'll take, till about 2028, 2029. So, and I think if you turn to page, I think it's 46. Yeah, 46 here, you can kind of see that a little bit. And those aren't exact, but those are projections. And the last thing to note is that we're in year 2 of an actuarial study. So we'll be engaging with Milliman here this spring to do it again. And I know things won't tremendously change, but they will, because we'll have less people in undefined groups. And, as that happens, these numbers should get more real and closer to what we think it'll be. So.
And that's part of the standard is, every 2 years in most cases is getting that new valuation because things change, benefits, people, rates, things like that. So it gets you up to date information. Well, that is all the prepared information that I have. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you may have or help answer anything that I can.
Questions from the board? Ms. Kaiser?
Just an amazing job of another year of not having any, what's the special word we say, like material findings. Because that's fantastic.
Thank you, Kristen.
Nothing?
Nope.
Oh, that's good. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and presenting to us.
You always have a question.
What?
I know, usually.
Not on the audit. I have a question on the audit. Something's gone terribly wrong. No, I think we're good. I don't have any questions. So thank you so much for presenting to us this evening and
Thank
keep
you.
up the good work, Aaron, and your team, so we can have 3 years in a row of no material findings beyond having.
Thanks for all your work.
Yes.
Thank you. We
We
appreciate it.
Very unique.
Well, that's our meeting this evening. So I look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you much.